Hello and welcome to Theology Matters. This is Dr. John Clark, and today we want to continue our study of the Sermon on the Mount. And we have been spending time attempting to build up to the Sermon on the Mount, where we'll consider the passage verse by verse over the next couple of months. But we're spending a lot of time developing the context and developing the build up to this sermon. And one of the things that we said we want to be very careful of as we look at this sermon is to be very careful to primarily look to understand the interpretation of this sermon before we attempt to make any application. And we believe that this is why the sermon is being used, misused, misapplied in our country and really in the world today. It's a lack of desire to establish what the correct interpretation is to the correct audience from the correct teacher, right? So we all know that Jesus taught the Sermon on the Mount, but for many people, the context gets really murky because we confuse or don't take into account who his original audience was and what was going on at the time that he spoke to his original audience. We've already tried to establish that Jesus was speaking to Jews under the Mosaic law, and that at this point in the history of his ministry, when we get to Matthew chapter 5, he had not yet turned his attention to the Gentiles. His focus was still on the nation of Israel. In fact, we get to Matthew chapter 10, and he's still telling his disciples, don't go to the Gentiles. Just stay, focused on the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We see that in Matthew 10, 5 through 7. And so his focus is still on the nation of Israel at this point. We also saw that the buildup to the Sermon on the Mount was very much kingdom focused. The kingdom of God on earth that had been prophesied and promised to the Jewish nation that God intended to establish and that he was offering to the nation during these early chapters of Matthew in the person of Jesus Christ. And remember that John the Baptist began his forerunner ministry in Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. And then we see the baptism of Jesus in Matthew 3, 13 through 17. And then we see the testing of Jesus in the wilderness by Satan in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 11. And then we see the beginning of Jesus's public teaching and healing ministry at the end of Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 25. And so by the time we get to Matthew chapter 5, this is what has been going on up to this point of time. And one of the things that we need to understand that is as Jesus and his forerunner, John the Baptist, is offering the kingdom of heaven to the nation of Israel, we've got to understand the significance of that offer from an Old Testament perspective. And remember, this earthly kingdom that they were promising would provide the ultimate and final fulfillment of all three provisions of the Abrahamic covenant, which were land, seed, and blessing. And the Abrahamic covenant is found in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3. And let me read that before we start making some connections there. It says, Now the Lord had said to Abram, Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house to a land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you and will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And so we see these three provisions, these three promises within Abrahamic covenant. And we know that those three provisions were further expanded upon in three additional covenants. We saw the land covenant or the Palestinian land covenant recorded in Deuteronomy 30. We saw the seed covenant recorded, and that was given to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And then we also see the new covenant given to the nation of Israel and Judah, and that's recorded in Jeremiah 31. And so those are further descriptions of those provisions in the original Abrahamic covenant. But this earthly kingdom was going to bring all three of those provisions together. It was going to be this final fulfillment of what God had promised and what the Jewish people were looking forward to. And so we see this language in the Gospels. And so in Jesus's birth announcement, even, let's go to Luke chapter 1. We're going to see this reference to the seed covenant, this promise made to David regarding his descendant, and then tying it to the birth of Jesus Christ. Look at Luke 1, verse 30 through 33. It says this, and the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bring forth a son, and shall call his name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Highest, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and of his kingdom there will be no end. And so Jesus came as the seed of David, this Davidic covenant, this promise that one of David's descendants would reign on his throne forever, and that this kingdom would have no end. This is the kingdom made of stone, spoken of in Daniel 2, that would crush to powder the other kingdoms of this world. And Jesus was here. He was the seed promised through Abraham and through David's line. And so clearly, if Jesus was this messianic king, then he would rule over Israel, who would inhabit their entire promised land because of God's promise to regather them. And then additionally, when we look at the new covenant and their promise and the promises and blessings within there, we see that those will also be fully implemented during this time period. And one of the things that was needed for the new covenant to be enacted or to be put in place is the death of the testator. And so it was this need for the testator to enact the new covenant blessings via his death is subtly mentioned or at least referred to in Matthew 5:20, which is really one of the key verses to understanding the Sermon on the Mount. And that is this, for I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. In fact, this is what we talk about in the gospel, that you and I, that Jesus' listeners at the time, which was the Jewish nation and his disciples, they lacked a righteousness that was equal to God's righteousness. And even the most righteous people of their day, as they were viewed, were the Pharisees and the scribes, and even they lacked a righteousness that was equal to God's righteousness. And so this is alluding to the fact that unless you and I have God's righteousness, but specifically to Jesus's audience here in the Sermon on the Mount, unless they had God's righteousness, they would by no means enter God's kingdom. And how did they get God's righteousness? How were they to obtain God's righteousness? Was it by trying harder to keep the law? Was it by trying harder to be a better Jew? No, it was going to be provided for them as a free gift when they put their faith in the finished work of the Messiah. And we see that kind of concept recorded all over the New Testament, but specifically in Romans 3:21 through 22, which reads this, but now the righteousness of God, that's what we're looking for here, the righteousness of God, apart from the law is revealed, being witnessed by the law and the prophets, even the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference. And you'll see that Paul says that the righteousness of God uh, was witnessed by the law and the prophets. That means the Old Testament taught faith righteousness, not works righteousness, as it relates to being accepted by God. So this was not a new concept, but the coming of Jesus Christ clarified what was God's solution for sin. Well, it was that he would send his son to pay the penalty for sin for anyone who would trust in him as their substitute. And then how would God deal with mankind's lack of righteousness? Well, he would take their substitute's righteousness and credit it to their account. So God takes care of both of these needs through the gospel. That's why the gospel is good news. These unsolvable problems that we had, God solved it through sending his dear son and through the work that he accomplished on the cross for each one of us. And so as we kind of dive in now to the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to look at a couple of verses here, and then really set the context for the rest of the sermon, if we can. And so, again, this is kind of the buildup. This is the offering of the kingdom, and now we've got Jesus's teaching regarding the kingdom of heaven and this kingdom that he's offering. And again, remember his audience, verses 1 and 2. We see that Jesus goes up on a mountain. We don't know the exact location. And he goes up there to teach his disciples in the surrounding Jewish crowds, and he's teaching them regarding the kingdom. And we see in verse 1, seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him, and then he opened his mouth and taught them. And then we'll look at exactly what he taught them. But one of the things that we're going to see is when he finishes this sermon, his audience is going to be astounded, the text tells us, at his teaching, because he taught with authority, not as the scribes. And one of the ways that the scribes taught was they would quote other rabbis. They never spoke from an authoritative place because they probably didn't understand the scriptures for themselves. They were just used to repeating things from other people. And so additionally, we pick up from the preceding context that Jesus, this is the context in chapter 4, was that Jesus was doing verifiable messianic miracles to not only validate his identity, but also to validate his message of the gospel of the kingdom. And what is the gospel of the kingdom? What's the good news of the kingdom? Well, the good news of the kingdom is that the king is here and he's ready to establish the kingdom. That's the good news of the kingdom. That's the gospel of the kingdom. The king is here. The kingdom is being presented to you. God is ready to establish that kingdom right now. And that was the message that Jesus was preaching. And so now we're going to look at a section commonly known as the Beatitudes. But to do that, I want to introduce the Beatitudes with a couple of introductory comments, which we'll conclude in the next session as well. We won't get through all of these this session, but one of the things that we've got to understand about this kingdom that Jesus was offering, that John was preaching about as his forerunner, is it's going to be the most unique kingdom that ever existed in terms of structure and values. And when we look at the structure of this kingdom, it's very intriguing. We've never seen anything like it ever in the course of human history, because the structure is going to be King Jesus. He's going to be reigning on the throne in Jerusalem, on King David's throne. He's going to have an administrative staff that's comprised of glorified Old Testament saints, glorified tribulation saints, and glorified church age saints. That means his administration will be corruption free, because each one of those glorified saints will no longer have a sin nature. They will be completely glorified, delivered from the very presence of sin, and they're only going to execute the desires of their king, Jesus. Now, who are the subjects of this kingdom? Well, the subjects of this kingdom are going to be human Jews who are benefiting from the blessings of the new covenant. That's when the new covenant blessings for the Jewish nation are going to be enacted. And then human Gentiles who are also benefiting from the blessings of society that's ruled in total righteousness and justice. And where do these subjects come from? Well, if we put our eschatology all together, these are going to be initially human Jews and human Gentiles who have believed in Jesus and who have survived the 7-year tribulation period on earth, and they will enter into the kingdom. And then as they repopulate, they will also give birth. They will be given in marriage, and they'll give birth to other human beings who will then grow and give birth and marry and continue on during that 1,000-year period. And so next time we'll continue and we'll look at the values of this kingdom as well.